Bonnie Liltz. June 2015. In Schaumburg, Illinois. Bonnie Liltz appeared to be a devoted mother living a quiet, ordinary life. To neighbors and acquaintances, she was seen as patient, responsible, and committed to caring for her adopted daughter. Her home reflected stability. Her daily routine reflected duty. From the outside, there was little to suggest that tragedy was approaching. Courtney Liltz was 28 years old. She was severely disabled and required constant care. Her condition shaped every aspect of family life. Medical appointments, medications, and specialized support were part of the household routine. To those who knew them, Bonnie's role as a caregiver appeared demanding but unwavering. Yet, behind the appearance of dedication, pressure was quietly building. Bonnie Liltz's life was defined by responsibility. She had adopted Courtney knowing the extent of her disabilities. Over time, the physical, emotional, and financial demands of caregiving intensified. The family's world became smaller. Isolation increased. Stress accumulated. Friends later recalled that Bonnie often spoke about exhaustion. She described feeling overwhelmed. She worried about the future. She questioned what would happen to Courtney if she could no longer provide care. The environment around her offered limited relief. Support systems were strained. Mental health resources were not always accessible or consistent. The burden of long-term caregiving remained largely private. Then the situation reached a breaking point. What happened next? How did a life defined by caregiving transform into a fatal decision? Why did a mother cross a line that could never be undone? In June 2015, events unfolded quietly inside the Liltz home. Bonnie administered medication to Courtney. The dosage was far beyond what had been prescribed. The intent was not medical treatment. It was an attempt to end Courtney's life and her own. Courtney's condition deteriorated rapidly. Emergency services were called. Medical personnel attempted to stabilize her. Despite intervention, the damage was irreversible. Courtney died from a drug overdose. Bonnie survived. Authorities launched an investigation immediately. Police examined medical records, prescription information, and the sequence of events leading up to the overdose. Investigators determined that the medication had been deliberately administered in lethal quantities. There was no evidence of an accident. Statements from medical professionals and family members painted a picture of long-term stress and emotional strain. Bonnie was arrested and charged. As the legal process unfolded, the case raised complex questions. Was this an act of violence, desperation, or mental collapse? Where did criminal responsibility end and systemic failure begin? In May 2016, Bonnie Liltz pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. The court acknowledged the severity of the crime, while also recognizing the unusual circumstances surrounding it. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The verdict reflected a balance between accountability and compassion. Courtroom discussions focused on caregiving burnout, mental health pressures, and the absence of adequate support structures for families caring for severely disabled individuals. But the story did not end with the sentence. After serving part of her term, Bonnie was released under conditions that required her to return to prison later. During this period, she lived under the weight of her actions and their consequences. Public attention faded, but the psychological toll remained. In November 2017, Bonnie Liltz was found dead. Authorities concluded that her death was an apparent suicide. She died before she could return to prison to complete her sentence. The case left lasting questions. Psychologically, the incident highlighted the dangers of prolonged caregiver stress. Long-term responsibility without sufficient emotional or institutional support can erode judgment and resilience. In Bonnie's case, exhaustion, fear of the future, and possible untreated mental health issues converged into a single irreversible act. Socially, the tragedy exposed gaps in systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals and their caregivers. Families caring for severely disabled adults often operate in isolation. navigating medical, financial, and emotional challenges with limited assistance. When warning signs appear, they are frequently overlooked or misunderstood. For Courtney Liltz, the outcome was final and devastating. Her life ended not through external violence, but through the actions of the person entrusted with her care. For the community, the case served as a reminder that quiet households can conceal profound struggles. For the legal system, it underscored the difficulty of judging crimes rooted in desperation rather than malice. And for society, it raised an unsettling question. How many similar pressures remain unseen until it is too late? The next case would involve another family where responsibility, isolation, and hidden conflict led to consequences no one expected. Andrea Lungsford. September 2024. In the quiet neighborhoods of Peoria, Andrea Lungsford appeared to be an ordinary young mother, adjusting to life with a newborn child. To those around her, she seemed like many parents, facing the challenges of early parenthood. There were no public warnings, no visible signs that something deeply troubling was unfolding behind the routine of daily life. But in September 2024, a single event would transform her life into the center of a criminal investigation and leave an entire community searching for answers. Andrea Lungsford was living in Peoria during a period marked by personal pressure and uncertainty. Her 1-month-old son, whose name has not been publicly released, was entirely dependent on her care. The details of her personal life and emotional state remain part of an ongoing investigation, but authorities have indicated that the child was living in a vulnerable environment. In cases involving infant deaths, the questions are never simple. They extend beyond what happened to why it happened and how it could have been prevented. What happened next? How did a situation involving a newborn escalate into a homicide investigation? And why did a life that had barely begun end in such devastating circumstances? On a day in September 2024, events unfolded that would later become the focus of legal and public scrutiny. According to investigators, Andrea Lungsford left her infant son inside a U-Haul truck under extreme heat conditions. The precise timeline is still under review, but evidence suggests the child was exposed to dangerously high temperatures for a significant period. Inside the enclosed vehicle, temperatures would have risen rapidly. For a 1-month-old infant whose body cannot regulate heat effectively, such conditions are often fatal within a short time. Eventually, the child was found unresponsive. Emergency responders were called, but their efforts were unsuccessful. The infant was pronounced dead, and what initially appeared to be a tragic incident quickly became a criminal investigation. Law enforcement officers secured the scene and began collecting evidence. They examined the truck, documented environmental conditions, and reconstructed the sequence of events leading up to the child's death. Medical examiners later determined that the cause of death was consistent with heat exposure and neglect. Investigators interviewed witnesses, reviewed available surveillance footage, and analyzed Andrea Lungsford's actions before and after the incident. Their findings suggested that the circumstances were not accidental. Authorities concluded that the infant's death was preventable, leading prosecutors to pursue serious criminal charges. Andrea Lungsford was charged with first-degree murder and endangering the life or health of a child. The severity of the charges reflected the prosecution's position that the death resulted from extreme recklessness or deliberate disregard for the child's safety. She was taken into custody, and legal proceedings began soon afterward. As of now, the case remains pending trial. Prosecutors are preparing evidence, while the defense is expected to challenge interpretations of intent, responsibility, and mental state. The outcome will ultimately be decided in court, but beyond legal arguments, the case raises broader questions about parental responsibility and systemic failures. Why do tragedies like this occur? Experts often point to a complex combination of factors. Postpartum mental health issues can impair judgment and emotional stability. Economic hardship and unstable living conditions can intensify stress. Isolation can prevent struggling parents from receiving support or intervention. In some cases, warning signs are overlooked by family members or institutions. In others, there are no clear signals until it is too late. The death of a 1-month-old child is not only a legal matter, it is social and psychological crisis that forces communities to confront uncomfortable realities about neglect, accountability, and support systems. For the family connected to the infant, the loss is permanent. For the community in Peoria, the case has become a reminder of how fragile life can be when care fails. And, for the justice system, it is a test of how to balance punishment with an understanding of underlying causes. As the trial approaches, many questions remain unanswered. Was this an act of intent or the result of overwhelming circumstances? Could intervention have changed the outcome? And what lessons can be learned to prevent similar tragedies in the future? The answers may emerge through court proceedings and psychological evaluations. But for now, the story of Andrea Lunsford and her infant son remains unresolved, suspended between accusation and judgment. The next case would involve another family, another child, and another moment where ordinary life turned into irreversible tragedy. Joanne Cunningham, April 2019. In the quiet suburban community of Crystal Lake, Illinois, Joanne Cunningham appeared to be an ordinary mother, living an unremarkable life. To neighbors and teachers, she seemed like a parent, struggling with everyday responsibilities, raising children in a typical household. From the outside, nothing suggested that her home would become the center of one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in the region. Behind closed doors, however, a different reality was forming. Joanne Cunningham was the mother of Andrew Ajay Freund, a 5-year-old boy, described by relatives and teachers as small, quiet, and vulnerable. He attended kindergarten, followed routines, and was known to be polite and shy. His family lived in a modest home in Crystal Lake, a town known for its calm neighborhoods. In the years leading up to 2019, concerns about instability within the household began to surface. There were questions about discipline and the overall safety of the children in the home. Social services had been alerted in the past, but the family remained together. What happened next? How did routine family struggles escalate into lethal violence? Why did a young child endure abuse that went unnoticed until it was too late? In early April 2019, the events that would later be reconstructed by investigators began to unfold. According to court records and confessions, AJ was subjected to repeated physical abuse inside his home. On or around April 14, 2019, the violence intensified. Joanne Cunningham assaulted her son with severe force, causing injuries that would ultimately prove fatal. After the beating, AJ did not receive medical attention. Instead, his body was concealed. In the days that followed, Cunningham and her partner reported AJ as missing. They told authorities that the boy had disappeared while walking to school. The story immediately raised concerns among investigators. Search teams were deployed across Crystal Lake. Police canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed neighbors, and reviewed surveillance footage. At the same time, child welfare records revealed a troubling history of prior investigations into the household. As questioning intensified, inconsistencies in the parents' statements became apparent. Investigators noted contradictory details and signs of deception. Under pressure, Cunningham eventually confessed. She admitted that AJ had died inside the home and that his body had been buried in a shallow grave near the property. Authorities located the grave and recovered the child's remains. The discovery confirmed the extent of the violence and the deliberate attempt to conceal the crime. Forensic examination documented injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. The investigation also exposed systemic failures, including missed warning signs and gaps in child protection oversight. In December 2019, Joanne Cunningham entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. The court acknowledged the severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. In July 2020, she was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Her partner faced separate charges related to the abuse and concealment of the child's death. Why did this happen? Experts pointed to multiple contributing factors, including chronic stress, dysfunctional family dynamics, and patterns of violent discipline. The case also raised questions about institutional responsibility. How did repeated reports fail to prevent a fatal outcome? The psychological analysis suggested a combination of control, frustration, and failure to cope with parental responsibility. Jay's dependence and vulnerability made him an easy target within an environment where violence had become normalized. At a broader level, the case illustrated how weaknesses in child welfare systems can leave at-risk children exposed to ongoing harm. The aftermath of the crime extended beyond the courtroom. AJ's death deeply affected his extended family and the Crystal Lake community. Public outrage followed, accompanied by calls for reform in child protection policies. The case became a symbol of the consequences of missed intervention and unchecked domestic abuse. For those who had known AJ, the loss was irreversible. For the community, the case shattered the illusion that such violence could not occur in quiet neighborhoods. The next case would involve a different family, a different setting, and a different motive. But the underlying question would remain the same. How does violence emerge where safety is expected, and why is it sometimes discovered only after it is too late? Marilyn Lamack. In the late 1990s, Marilyn Lamack appeared to be an ordinary mother, living in the quiet suburban city of Naperville, Illinois. To neighbors and acquaintances, she was a trained nurse, a devoted parent, and a woman trying to maintain stability during a difficult divorce. From the outside, her life seemed controlled and familiar. Inside her home, however, a crisis was unfolding that would end in one of the most disturbing family crimes in the city's history. Marilyn Lamack was married to Timothy Lamack, a successful attorney. Together, they had 3 children. Nicholas was 7 years old. Emily was 6. Thomas was 3. The family lived in an affluent community where expectations of normalcy were high. But behind the public image of a stable household, the marriage was collapsing. By 1999, the couple was in the middle of an intense divorce and custody dispute. Financial pressures, emotional conflict, and fear of losing control over her children began to shape Marilyn's state of mind. Friends and relatives would later describe her as increasingly anxious and resentful. As a nurse, she had access to prescription medications and medical knowledge. As a mother facing separation, she was struggling with feelings of rejection, anger, and helplessness. What happened next? How did a domestic conflict escalate into irreversible violence? Why did a mother cross the boundary that most people believe is impossible to cross? On the night of March 4, 1999, events unfolded quietly inside the Lamack home. According to investigators, Marilyn administered prescription medication to her children. The drugs were intended to sedate them. Once the children were unconscious, she moved from room to room. Nicholas was found in his bed. Emily was in her bedroom. Thomas was asleep in his crib. Each child was suffocated while they slept. The sequence of events was deliberate and controlled. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle that suggested an outside intruder. The crime occurred within the privacy of a family home, carried out by the person who was expected to protect them. The following morning, the deaths were discovered. Emergency responders arrived at the house to find the 3 children unresponsive. Attempts to revive them failed. The scene immediately raised questions. There were no signs of accident or natural causes. As investigators examined the home, they began to focus on Marilyn Lamack. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of prescription drugs in the children's systems. The pattern of sedation followed by suffocation indicated intent rather than negligence. Police interviews, forensic evidence, and the context of the ongoing divorce began to form a clear picture. Witnesses described Marilyn's emotional state in the weeks leading up to the crime. Friends recalled her fear of losing custody. Relatives spoke of her anger toward her estranged husband. Prosecutors argued that the murders were not impulsive but calculated. They claimed she killed her children to punish Timothy Lamack and to prevent him from gaining custody. In 2001, Marilyn Lamack stood trial for 3 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom became a place where 2 narratives collided: The defense suggested mental instability and emotional collapse. The prosecution presented evidence of planning, medical knowledge, and motive rooted in control and revenge. Jurors listened to forensic testimony, psychological evaluations, and accounts from family members. They examined the timeline of events and the medical evidence. Ultimately, the jury concluded that Marilyn Lemak was legally responsible for her actions. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Why did this happen? Psychologists and legal experts have pointed to multiple factors. The case reflects the destructive potential of unresolved conflict during divorce. It also raises questions about the intersection of mental health, access to medication, and the pressure of custody battles. Some analysts argue that the crime was driven by a desire for control. Others highlight emotional collapse and narcissistic injury. There are also broader social questions. Could warning signs have been recognized earlier? Did the family, legal system, or community underestimate the psychological strain involved? The aftermath of the case left lasting scars. The Lemak children became symbols of a tragedy that shattered assumptions about safety within families. Their father was forced to confront an unimaginable loss. The Naperville community struggled to understand how such violence could occur in a seemingly stable environment. It remains a reminder that extreme violence can emerge not only from criminal backgrounds but from ordinary lives under extraordinary pressure. The next case would involve another family conflict where control, fear, and emotional breakdown led to a fatal outcome, revealing how fragile the boundary between normal life and irreversible tragedy can become. Jessica Logan. In the fall of 2019, Jessica Logan appeared to be an ordinary young mother living in Decatur, Illinois. To neighbors and relatives, she seemed quiet, responsible, and focused on caring for her toddler son. She spoke about motherhood, shared moments of daily life, and presented herself as a parent trying to manage the demands of raising a young child. From the outside, there were no visible signs of danger, no public history of violence, no obvious warning that a tragedy was approaching. But behind the routine of everyday life, a different reality was forming. Jessica Logan lived in Macon County, a community shaped by economic challenges and limited social support systems. Her personal relationships were unstable, financial and emotional pressures were constant. Like many young parents, she faced isolation and responsibility with limited resources. Jaden Marshawn Comage was 19 months old. He was described by relatives as energetic, curious, and affectionate. He depended entirely on the adults around him for safety, care, and protection. Yet questions remained beneath the surface. How stable was Jessica Logan's mental state? How much stress was she carrying alone? And how did those pressures influence her decisions? What happened next? How did an ordinary household become the focus of a homicide investigation? Why did this happen? On October 7, 2019, the day began like many others. Jaden was at home with his mother. At some point during the day, emergency services were contacted. When first responders arrived, they found the toddler unresponsive. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation. Despite their efforts, Jaden could not be saved. As police began their initial assessment, inconsistencies emerged. Jessica Logan's explanations about the events leading up to Jaden's condition were unclear and changed over time. Medical findings raised concerns that the death was not accidental. Investigators began treating the case as suspicious. Detectives expanded their investigation beyond the home. They reviewed phone records, digital data, and internet activity. During this review, they discovered a search conducted the day before Jaden's death. The phrase was direct and alarming. How do you suffocate? For investigators, this discovery altered the direction of the case. It suggested planning rather than accident. It raised the possibility that Jaden's death was preceded by deliberate intent. Autopsy results later confirmed that Jaden died from suffocation. There was no evidence of a natural medical condition that could explain his death. Based on the combination of medical findings, digital evidence, and behavioral indicators, prosecutors moved forward with criminal charges. Jessica Logan was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. In June 2021, her trial began in Illinois. Over the course of 3 days, prosecutors presented a structured case. They argued that Jessica Logan intentionally suffocated her son and attempted to portray the incident as a sudden medical emergency. They highlighted the internet search as evidence of premeditation. They emphasized inconsistencies in her statements and actions. They also presented expert testimony analyzing the 911 call placed after Jaden was found unresponsive. The defense challenged the prosecution's narrative. Attorneys argued that the digital search was being misinterpreted and did not prove intent. They questioned the reliability of 911 call analysis, describing it as controversial and scientifically uncertain. They suggested that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Jessica Logan was found guilty of first-degree murder. Later in 2021, the court sentenced her to 33 years in prison. The judge concluded that the evidence demonstrated intentional harm rather than negligence or accident. The legal battle did not end with the verdict. In the years that followed, Jessica Logan's defense team appealed her conviction. They argued that the use of behavioral analysis from the 911 call unfairly influenced the jury. They claimed that such evidence should not have been allowed in court. In 2024, the Illinois Supreme Court reviewed the case. After examining the trial record and legal arguments, the court upheld the conviction. The ruling confirmed that the evidence met the standards required for a murder conviction. Why did this happen? From a psychological and social perspective, the case raised complex questions. Experts often point to overlapping factors in cases involving child homicide. These may include emotional instability, overwhelming stress, isolation, loss of control, and untreated mental health issues. The case also highlighted broader systemic concerns, including the limits of social support networks and the growing role of digital evidence in modern criminal investigations. The aftermath of Jaden Comage's death extended far beyond the courtroom. His family faced irreversible loss. The community of Decatur was left confronting the reality that violence can occur within ordinary homes. Public discussions emerged about parental stress, mental health resources, and the responsibility of institutions to identify hidden warning signs. Jessica Logan remains incarcerated, serving her sentence under the Illinois Department of Corrections. For many observers, the tragedy is defined by one central question. At what point does pressure become intent? The next case would involve another family, another community, and a different set of warning signs that went unnoticed until it was too late. Elżbieta Płakowska, October 2012. In public, Elżbieta Płakowska appeared to be an ordinary suburban mother. She lived in Naperville, Illinois, a community known for safety and family life. She was seen as a devoted parent and a responsible babysitter. Nothing in her daily routine suggested that, behind closed doors, something far darker was forming. The contrast between appearance and reality would become devastatingly clear on October 30th, 2012. Elżbieta's life was shaped by personal strain and emotional instability. She was a single mother raising her 7-year-old son, Justin Płakowski. Her relationships were complicated, and her social environment was marked by isolation and emotional conflict. Those who knew her described mood swings and detachment from reality. Yet, within suburban life, her struggles remained largely invisible. She also cared for Olivia Dworkowski, a 5-year-old girl she occasionally babysat. To the outside world, the arrangement seemed routine. Parents trusted her. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. What happened next? How did ordinary domestic life turn into an act of extreme violence? Why did the situation escalate to a point from which there was no return? On the evening of October 30th, 2012, events unfolded inside Elżbieta's home in a tragic sequence. Justin was in the house with his mother. Olivia was there under Elżbieta's care. 2 family dogs were also present. At some point during the night, violence erupted. Elżbieta attacked her son and the child she was babysitting. The assault was prolonged and deliberate. Both children were killed. The dogs were also killed during the same episode. After the incident, Elżbieta did not flee. Instead, she attempted to construct a narrative to deflect suspicion. She contacted authorities and suggested that an unknown intruder had broken into the home and committed the killings. When police arrived, they began a systematic investigation of the scene. Officers quickly noticed inconsistencies in her story. There were no signs of forced entry. The physical evidence did not support the presence of an outside attacker. Her timeline conflicted with forensic findings. Investigators collected evidence, analyzed blood patterns, and examined the condition of the home. Witness statements were reviewed. Gradually, the intruder narrative collapsed. As questioning intensified, Elżbieta's explanations became less coherent. Her emotional responses appeared inconsistent with the events she described. Authorities concluded that the evidence pointed not to an external threat, but to someone already inside the home. Elżbieta Płakowska was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The legal process that followed was long and complex. Her defense focused on her mental state, arguing that psychological instability played a role in the crime. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate nature of her actions and the attempt to mislead investigators. The trial extended over several years. The court heard testimony from forensic experts, psychologists, law enforcement officers, and witnesses. Each piece of evidence reinforced the conclusion that the killings were intentional. In 2017, Elżbieta Płakowska was convicted on 10 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict reflected both the severity of the crime and the court's determination that she bore full responsibility. Beyond the legal outcome, the case raised difficult questions about mental health and warning signs that often go unnoticed. Was this tragedy the result of untreated psychological illness? Did systemic failures allow a crisis to grow unchecked? Or was it a case of personal agency overriding any external explanation? Experts pointed to emotional instability and loss of control as possible motives. The violence appeared to be the culmination of unresolved internal conflict. Yet, no single explanation fully accounts for what happened. The aftermath was profound. Justin Płakowski and Olivia Dworakowski were remembered as joyful children whose lives ended too soon. Their families were left with irreversible loss. The Naperville community struggled to reconcile the tragedy with its sense of safety. For many, the case remains a reminder that danger does not always come from outside. Sometimes, it grows quietly within familiar spaces, hidden behind ordinary routines. The next case would involve another family that appeared stable from the outside, until a single moment revealed a reality that no one had expected. Sarah Safranek. In November 2021, in the quiet town of Oregon, Illinois, Sarah Safranek appeared to be an ordinary mother living a routine life. To neighbors, she seemed reserved, responsible, and focused on raising her young son. Nathaniel Burton was 7 years old. He attended school, had classmates, and followed the rhythms of childhood. From the outside, there were no visible signs of danger. But behind the walls of their home, a different reality was slowly unfolding. Sarah Safranek's life was shaped by pressures that few people around her fully understood. She was a single parent navigating emotional stress, responsibility, and isolation in a small community. Friends later described her as overwhelmed at times, yet functional in public. There were no official reports of violence in the years leading up to the tragedy. No intervention from authorities. No clear warnings that something irreversible was approaching. What happened next? How did a private struggle transform into a fatal act? Why did no one recognize the risk sooner? In November 2021, events inside the Safranek home reached a breaking point. On a day that began like many others, Sarah Safranek was alone with her son. According to her later confession, she placed a pillow over Nathaniel Burton's face and held it there. The act was not sudden or accidental. It was deliberate. Nathaniel struggled to breathe. When the pressure was finally released, he was unresponsive. Emergency services were contacted, and the child was rushed to a hospital. Doctors attempted life-saving measures, but the damage was severe. Later that day, Nathaniel Burton was pronounced dead. The initial circumstances raised questions. How could a healthy child die inside his own home? What had truly happened before the emergency call? As investigators began their work, they examined the scene, medical reports, and family history. Autopsy findings indicated that Nathaniel's death was consistent with suffocation. There were no signs of an accident. The physical evidence contradicted any claim of natural causes. When questioned by authorities, Sarah Safranek's statements evolved. Eventually, she admitted that the incident was not isolated. She told investigators that she had held pillows over her son's face repeatedly over the years. What began as disturbing behavior had escalated into lethal violence. Her confession altered the direction of the investigation. Police documented her statements, collected forensic evidence, and reconstructed the timeline of events. The case was presented to prosecutors in Ogle County. Sarah Safranek was charged with first-degree murder. For nearly 4 years, the legal process unfolded. Court hearings examined the evidence, her mental state, and the pattern of abuse revealed through her admissions. In November 2025, Sarah Safranek entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. The court evaluated aggravating and mitigating factors. The victim's age, the prolonged nature of the abuse, and the intentional act weighed heavily in the final decision. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The legal outcome closed the criminal case, but it did not resolve the deeper questions. Why did this happen? Psychological analysis suggested a combination of factors. Chronic stress, emotional instability, and possible untreated mental health issues were considered. Some experts pointed to the dynamics of control and frustration within isolated parent-child relationships. Others questioned systemic failures. Were there missed opportunities for intervention? Could schools, family members, or social services have detected warning signs earlier? Was the pattern of abuse visible to anyone outside the home? In cases like this, violence does not always appear suddenly. It often develops quietly, hidden behind ordinary routines and familiar faces. Nathaniel Burton's death left a lasting impact on the community of Oregon, Illinois. Residents struggled to reconcile the image of a quiet household with the reality of sustained abuse. For those who knew the child, his absence became a reminder of vulnerabilities that often go unnoticed. His story also raised broader concerns about child protection systems and mental health support for struggling parents. The tragedy did not end with a verdict. It continued in the grief of extended family, the questions left unanswered, and the lessons that institutions and communities were forced to confront. The next case would involve another family where the warning signs were subtle, the danger was underestimated, and the consequences were irreversible. Janie Perry. December 2021. In North Chicago, Illinois, Janie Perry was seen by neighbors as a single mother trying to navigate the challenges of daily life. To the outside world, she appeared ordinary, private, and focused on raising her young son. There was nothing in her public image that suggested she would be connected to a crime that would shock the community. The contrast between her role as a parent and the events that followed became the central question in a disturbing case. Damari Perry was 6 years old, described by relatives as a quiet child who enjoyed simple routines. He looked forward to birthdays like any other child his age. On December 29, 2021, his 6th birthday, what should have been a day of celebration, instead became the beginning of a fatal sequence of events. Janie Perry's life reflected stress and instability. She faced financial pressures and the challenges of raising a child alone. Those close to the family later spoke of strict discipline and tension within the home. The environment in which Damari grew up was marked by isolation rather than support. Questions about parenting, mental health, and access to help would later emerge as critical elements of the investigation. What happened next? How did a moment of discipline become fatal? Why did this occur in a home meant to provide safety? On the evening of December 29, 2021, Janie Perry forced Damari into the bathroom and held him under a cold shower as punishment. The water was extremely cold, and the exposure lasted long enough to cause his body temperature to drop to dangerous levels. Hypothermia set in. Despite his deteriorating condition, she did not seek immediate medical help. Hours later, Damari was dead. In the days that followed, Perry attempted to conceal the crime. Damari was missing, and the circumstances of his disappearance were unclear. Eventually, his body was found in Gary, Indiana. The location raised suspicion and prompted investigators to reconstruct the events leading to his death. Police examined the scene, interviewed family members, and collected forensic evidence. The medical examiner confirmed that hypothermia caused Damari's death, consistent with prolonged exposure to cold water. Investigators also analyzed phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements to trace Perry's movements after her son's death. Inconsistencies in her statements highlighted her role in the fatal act. By 2025, prosecutors had built a case proving deliberate harm. In December 2025, Perry pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, acknowledging that Damari's death was not accidental. Prosecutors recommended a 45-year prison sentence, with sentencing scheduled for January 2026. Why would a parent harm a child? Experts suggested that stress, isolation, and emotional instability can escalate into abusive behavior. The case also highlighted systemic failures in identifying warning signs and intervening in high-risk households. Damari's death left relatives and the community grieving and questioning how such abuse could occur unnoticed. The tragedy underscored the vulnerability of children and the limits of parental authority when combined with unchecked anger and neglect. As the Perry case moved toward sentencing, the story remained a stark reminder that severe abuse often hides behind ordinary appearances. The next case would involve a different household, a different child, and a different set of circumstances. But the same haunting question: how does abuse go unnoticed until it is too late? Andrea Hagler, May 2022. In Chicago's uptown neighborhood, Andrea Hagler appeared to be an ordinary single mother. To neighbors and acquaintances, she was quiet, reserved, and focused on raising her child. She kept to herself and avoided attention. Nothing in her public life suggested that violence was approaching. Amaria Osby was 8 years old. She attended elementary school, had friends, and followed the routines of childhood. Teachers described her as energetic and expressive. From the outside, the family seemed stable, but behind closed doors, a different reality was forming. Andrea Hagler and her daughter shared the same birthday. Family members later said Hagler often spoke about this connection. She described it as meaningful and, at times, spiritual. In the months before May 2022, her mental state appeared to deteriorate. She became increasingly withdrawn and fixated on ideas of destiny and fate. No one around her fully understood the depth of what was happening. What happened next? How did a quiet household turn into a crime scene? Why did a mother commit an act that would permanently alter multiple lives? In May 2022, inside their Chicago apartment, the day of Amaria's 8th birthday began like any other. At some point, an emotional episode unfolded. According to investigators and court records, Hagler placed a plastic bag over her daughter's head. Amaria resisted and pleaded with her mother to stop. Within minutes, the situation ended in tragedy. Emergency services were called. Police and paramedics arrived to find Amaria unresponsive. Despite efforts to save her, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The apartment was secured, and investigators began documenting evidence. Hagler was interviewed and taken into custody. During questioning, she made statements that shaped the investigation. She reportedly said she felt it was their time to go. She linked this belief to the fact that she and her daughter shared the same birthday. Her words suggested not only intent but a distorted understanding of reality. Andriel Hagler was charged with first-degree murder. As the case moved through the legal system, the court examined both the facts of the crime and her mental condition. Psychological evaluations were conducted. Prosecutors argued that she understood her actions. The defense raised concerns about her mental stability and perception of reality. In February 2025, the court delivered its verdict. Hagler was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge emphasized the deliberate nature of the act and the vulnerability of the victim. She was sentenced under Illinois law, bringing the criminal proceedings to an end. But the legal outcome did not fully explain the deeper causes of the crime. Mental illness appeared to be a central factor. Her fixation on fate and identity reflected possible delusional thinking. Isolation and limited access to mental health support may have intensified her condition. The case also revealed broader systemic failures. Family members lacked the tools to intervene. Community institutions did not recognize the warning signs in time. The tragedy raised questions about how society identifies and responds to psychological crises. For the Uptown community, the impact was lasting. Neighbors struggled to reconcile Hagler's quiet image with the reality of her actions. Teachers and classmates mourned the loss of a child whose life ended too soon. For Amaria's family, the consequences were irreversible. Moments that once symbolized celebration became reminders of loss. The case became a stark example of how violence can emerge from untreated psychological decline. The next case would involve another family, another child, and another moment when trust inside a home was shattered beyond repair. Amanda Wallace, April 1993. In the early 1990s, Amanda Wallace appeared to be an ordinary young mother living in Chicago. To those around her, she seemed quiet, withdrawn, and focused on raising her child. Her son, Joseph Wallace, known as Joey, was 3 years old. He was described as playful, gentle, and dependent on his mother's care. From the outside, there were no clear signs that danger was approaching. Nothing in Amanda Wallace's public life suggested the tragedy that would soon unfold. Amanda Wallace lived under emotional strain and limited support. Her life was marked by instability, isolation, and psychological struggles. Family members later recalled that she often appeared overwhelmed by responsibility. During this period, Chicago's social service systems were under pressure, with many vulnerable families receiving minimal oversight. Within this environment, Amanda Wallace's condition gradually worsened, largely unnoticed. What happened next? How did a caregiver become a perpetrator? Why did warning signs fail to trigger intervention? In April 1993, events unfolded in a sequence, later reconstructed by investigators. Inside her residence, Amanda Wallace carried out actions that ended her son's life. Joseph Wallace was found suspended from a transom, with an electrical extension cord wrapped around his neck. Authorities later determined that the scene was intentional rather than accidental. There was no evidence of forced entry or involvement by another person. The timeline indicated that Amanda was alone with the child at the time. Her behavior afterward did not reflect a typical emergency response, raising suspicion among investigators. The discovery of Joseph Wallace's death triggered an immediate police investigation. Emergency responders confirmed the child was deceased. Detectives examined the scene, forensic evidence, and witness accounts. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. Interviews with Amanda Wallace and others revealed inconsistencies in her statements. Combined with physical evidence, these findings led authorities to conclude that the act was deliberate. The case quickly drew public attention and intensified scrutiny of child welfare systems. Amanda Wallace was charged with murder and held in custody pending trial. Prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated intent. The defense focused on her mental health and emotional instability. In June 1996, after a trial involving forensic evidence and psychological evaluations, Amanda Wallace was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, reflecting the severity of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. Beyond the courtroom, the case raised questions about mental illness, parental responsibility, and systemic failure. Experts pointed to untreated psychological conditions, chronic stress, and social isolation. Critics argued that earlier intervention by social services might have prevented the ADI tragedy. The case contributed to reviews of child welfare procedures in Illinois. The aftermath left a lasting trauma for Joseph Wallace's family and community. Public reaction in Chicago was marked by shock and debate over child protection policies. While serving her sentence, Amanda Wallace remained under observation by prison authorities. In 1997, 1 year after her conviction, she died in prison following an apparent suicide attempt. Years later, the case of Amanda Wallace remains a reminder of how private struggles can escalate into irreversible violence. It exposes the consequences of missed warning signs and institutional limitations. The next case would involve another family, where early signals were overlooked, leading to a crime that would once again challenge society's understanding of responsibility and prevention.